Do you know which exercise activates the pelvic floor the most? It's probably not the one you have in mind, and if you work with athletic patients who experience urine leakage or symptoms of incontinence, this is much more relevant to you than you might think, because the problem isn't just incontinence. The real problem is not having an objective way of knowing what is actually happening in that musculature while your patient is moving, running, jumping, or training. Up to 70% of young female athletes may present with symptoms of pelvic floor dysfunction, even without having given birth. And even so, in many cases, training and rehabilitation programs do not change. Why is that? Because most professionals do not have objective data to know whether the exercise they're using actually activates the pelvic floor or not. Subjective assessment has clear limits, and without real information, three things happen. We design programs without knowing whether the musculature can tolerate them. We rely solely on the patient's sensations, and when there is no improvement, we do not know exactly what to adjust. This is where surface electromyography with intracavitary probes comes in. Thanks to EMG, we can measure the actual activation of the pelvic floor during different exercises and positions. Not what should happen according to theory, but what is actually happening in that particular patient and in that specific exercise. And this completely changes the way clinical decisions are made. In a study carried out using the mDurance system to analyze the activation of the intracavitary pelvic floor muscles, the results showed very clear differences between exercises, and some findings completely contradict usual clinical intuition. The squat was by far the exercise that generated the greatest activation, 151.4% compared to the reference contraction measured in the supine position. That is to say, the pelvic floor works much harder during a squat than in static or lying positions. This has enormous clinical implications. If your aim is to stimulate and strengthen the pelvic floor, the squat can be one of the most effective tools available, provided the patient is ready to tolerate it. Next came the front plank and the quadruped position, with very similar values, around 122%. Both positions challenge the stability of the trunk and pelvis and require the pelvic floor to participate actively in order to maintain postural control. These are very useful exercises when you are not yet able to introduce heavier loads or when you are looking for more controlled progressions. At the opposite end, we find the supine position, static stand-in and the side plank with very low activations, barely above the reference value. This does not mean that they are useless exercises, but rather that they provide a much lower stimulus if the aim is to develop strength or functional capacity of the pelvic floor. And here lies the most important biomechanical key. Positions that challenge gravity and pelvic stability generate greater muscle activation. That is why many patients are able to correctly contract their pelvic floor while lying down during a clinical examination, but fail when they are standing, running or jumping. The demand changes completely. And how can you use this information in clinical practice? Firstly, by tailoring programs much more effectively according to each patient's sport and symptoms. A long-distance runner does not need the same as a patient who practices yoga or Pilates. Secondly, by using EMG to objectively check whether the pelvic floor is ready to tolerate impact before returning to sport. And thirdly, by safely adjusting progressions. You can start in quadruped or plank position and progress to more demanding exercises depending on the actual activation you observe in each session. A very common question is whether squats are safe for patients with pelvic floor dysfunction. And the answer is, it depends. Precisely because it generates a lot of activation, it can be very effective for strengthening, but it may also be excessive in the early stages if the muscles do not yet have sufficient capacity. Another common question is why lying down generates so little activation. The conclusion is very clear. The position in which you place your patient determines a large part of the activation you'll achieve in the pelvic floor. The squat clearly leads the ranking, followed by the front plank and the quadruped position, while lying down positions generate much less activation. Without electromyography, all this information remains in the realm of assumptions. With EMG, you can measure exactly what is happening in each patient and adjust your programs with real precision. Because it is not enough to know which exercise should work, you need to know if it is working for your specific patient.